All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to talk about political reconstruction. So our objectives and standards are to analyze Reconstruction plans after the Civil War and to understand achievements and failures of Reconstruction. Take a moment there to look over the standards, please. Excuse me. And our desired result, how did Reconstruction impact African Americans? So Lincoln and Reconstruction. So President Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, established a plan for bringing the southern states back into the Union, and this was in 1863. Now this was known as the 10% Plan. So any Southerner, except high-ranking officials or officers who swore allegiance to the United States and declared slavery illegal, could and would regain their citizenship and receive amnesty, which is no punishment for what they had done. Now, state governments would be formed after 10% of the state's 1860 voters swore loyalty to the U.S., and the new constitutions of these states had to be amended to ban slavery for the state to be recognized as part of the Union. Now, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee did rejoin the Union by the end of the war, and all of them elected members to Congress as well. So facing opposition, despite President Lincoln's goals, some Republicans felt that this plan was too easy on the South, and they felt that Southern states could rejoin the Union too easy, and many rejected the new congressional members from these states. So in return, they proposed a tougher Reconstruction plan, and this was known as the Wade-Davis Bill, which was proposed by Congress with two conditions. A loyalty oath must be taken by a majority of the state's adult white males, and constitutions of these states must abolish slavery and prohibit secession, meaning that they could not leave the country again. Any volunteer supporter of the Confederacy could also not hold or vote for political office. Now, President Lincoln did pocket veto this, meaning he basically kind of ignored it until it went away, because he felt that it was too tough on the South and would extend the length of the war. The assassination of President Lincoln. On April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln was fatally shot by a Southerner named John Wilkes Booth. Now, he was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and died later. Now, while huge crowds gathered to mourn the loss of the president, Lincoln and show respect to him, his final plans for Reconstruction are kind of left unknown, and this kind of leads people questioning about what Lincoln might have done after the war. So Vice President Andrew Johnson now becomes president, and many in the South were concerned what Johnson would do since he was a Union-supporting Southerner. What that means is Johnson was from the South, but he was part of a Southern kind of group that did not support the Southern states leaving the Union. So many people were afraid that Johnson would take action against the South because of this. So many in Congress hoped Johnson would take a strong stand on Reconstruction, but conflict soon erupted between Johnson and others. Under Johnson's plan to gain back property and citizenship, white Southerners had to swear loyalty and to receive amnesty. Confederates of high rank and owners of property over $20,000 needed a presidential pardon, but most were pardoned or forgiven anyway. And delegates from the states had to abolish slavery, repeal secession, and nullify all Confederate debts. Now, following these requirements, states could form new governments. So moving forward, in the summer of 1865, Johnson's Reconstruction plans moved ahead. Now, there were strong words against treason, but nearly every farmer, planter, and Confederate officer who applied for a pardon winded up receiving it. Now, many pre-war leaders and former Confederates did gain political office because of these pardons as well, and Republicans are not really satisfied with the plans. In December of 1865, when Congress met, members refused to seat these newly elected Southern representatives. So, laws against African Americans. The approval of Johnson's new southern state governments allowed state legislatures to pass discriminatory laws against African Americans. And these laws that controlled African Americans, similar to when they were slaves, were called, black codes. And prejudice continued in the South, while whites continued to hope to restore the power structure that had been before the Civil War. Now, these black codes were different state to state, and some gave more rights than others. However, in most states, Africans could still marry and testify in court against other African Americans. However, segregation or the separation of races occurred in public places, and African Americans were forbidden from owning guns or from testifying against whites in court. More trouble for African Americans. Black codes in states limited economic opportunities of former slaves, and many states taxed African Americans who did not work on plantations or in homes. There were some states that banned former slaves from buying land or renting property altogether, and African Americans were required to sign labor contracts in most states. If someone left their labor period before it ended, they could be arrested and lose their pay. And even if there was no labor contract, African Americans could still lose their jobs, be arrested, lose their wages, and be forced then to work off these fines. Now, African Americans were denied many rights under black codes. Now, remember, the whites wanted to restore this power structure in the South where they were in control, and African Americans in the South were subject to curfews, fines, arrest, and poor treatment. They had their homes invaded by local law enforcement, who also seized their property, and many African Americans were forced to go back to work on farms or plantations since they could not find jobs. Some black codes were able to be prevented by the U.S. military and the Freedmen's Bureau, and they also provided help with labor contracts. And African Americans, though, were angry still at their treatment, and some leaders held conventions to address these issues. Reconstruction by Congress. Many in the North began to worry that all the wartime sacrifices of humans, of property, of money would have been wasted if the South continued its old ways of treating African Americans like they were still slaves. So there's going to be growing opposition to President Johnson's Reconstruction plans, which caused many Republicans in Congress to take control. Now, fiercely opposed to Johnson's ideas, radical Republicans were led by Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, he's right up here, and also Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Now, they both wanted harsh terms and dramatic changes before Southern states could rejoin the Union. Radical Republicans also attacked Johnson for not giving African Americans the right to vote, but President Johnson believed that the states should have that right to decide what rights should be granted to African Americans. The largest group in Congress were the moderate Republicans, not the radical Republicans, but the middle-of-the-road people. Now, although many of them disliked Johnson's policies on Reconstruction, they wanted to work with him. They also opposed black codes and wanted to protect the rights of African Americans. In early 1866, they passed two bills. One, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which sought to extend the life of the program and allowed it to try some cases. And two, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which wanted to give the same legal rights of whites to African Americans. Now, President Johnson vetoed or denied both of these bills, but they were later passed by Congress, despite his support or his approval, and this is going to begin the battle for control of Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction Acts of strong measure were passed by Congress in 1867 and 1868. Now, in some cases, they kind of took away some of the decisions that Johnson had made in terms of approving state governments, and it also divided the South into 5 military districts under control of the U.S. Army. To rejoin the Union, states had to do a couple of things. They had to allow adult African Americans the right to vote, voters, including African American men, including including African American men, must have the right to elect state legislatures. They had to approve the 15th Amendment, which gave all African American men the right to vote, and the 15th Amendment also stated that no one can be denied the right to vote because of race or previous condition of servitude, like slavery. Now again, President Johnson is going to fight all of these acts, but Congress overrode his vetoes and approved them anyway. Johnson's going to run into some more deep trouble later on here. So when Congress passed a law requiring Senate approval for the president to remove cabinet members, Johnson refused to follow it, and Johnson attempted to fire Secretary of War Henry Stanton. He was a radical Republican, and Johnson doesn't want the radical Republicans having any more power. So when Johnson tries to remove him without the approval of the Senate, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him, or to try to remove him from office in 1868. However, Johnson will survive impeachment and not be removed as president by one vote. And this here is a picture of the Senate hearings or the impeachment trial of President Johnson. So again, President Johnson will survive impeachment by just one vote. Alright, so our closure here. How did Reconstruction impact African Americans? Think about the different policies that Lincoln was looking for. Think about some of the different policies Johnson is putting forward. And what are the radical Republicans and moderate Republicans doing to try to improve the lives of African Americans? Whether it be successfully or unsuccessfully, what are they trying to do in terms of governmental power to improve the lives of African Americans? Alright? Hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Try your best on the questions that follow, and hope you have a great day. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.